Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this IGE POSCO Group International Conference on embracing sustainable growth in the age of industrial transformation. It's a pleasure to be here and to lecture and to give a keynote to you. And I'm really deeply honored to follow up Jeremy Rifkin, who has been a hero of my academic life for a long time. And it's the first time in my life that I have the privilege to give a keynote following him. And I'm happy to directly follow up at least two of the major points that he addressed, which is using, of course, Germany as a case study, being ahead of the curve, with being the Green Deal center in Europe. And also I will follow up on the second point that Jerry made in the very end about industry transformation and the role that many of the industries particularly play that you are having in Korea, such as steel, and the new, I would say, I love the term that he used, revolution, that we have with regard to the consequences of the transition of the geopolitical and geoeconomic order of the 20th century to a new, I think, order that is just developing in the 21st century. And this comes, of course, again, with particular regard to what happened on February 24 in Europe, and I will refer to this later. So in what follows, I want to address you with a keynote, of course, related to the panel speeches on industrial growth in the age of net zero. And I will make basically 3 points. I will first look a little bit in the why. Why are we in this context here? And why are there so many conferences globally taking place? And there are so many questions in boardrooms, both and among policymakers, on the question how then to transform our economies into a net zero future. So this is a little bit my first point. My second point then goes straight into Germany as a case study, and I follow up many of the comments Jeremy made. And finally, my third point, I will look at 5 and very briefly look at 5, I would say, key strategies for the transformation of industry, particularly with regard to the experience we are facing here in Germany and in the broader EU framework, knowing that many of our Korean friends are looking carefully into the transformation and the policies implemented in Germany at the moment. I know this from my former time, in my former life as a political appointee in the German Foreign Office. So I start with why is this so urgent, this whole matters, and this goes back, of course, as every good narrative in this field, to COP21, when we discussed all these things earlier, 2015, in Paris. Paris is for me the starting point of what I would say is the great transformation. Being around the climate field since 1990, I think the acceleration that we have seen after the Paris contract is unheard of. What we all underestimated, that we were there in Paris, either in the role of negotiators or in the surrounding, was the reaction that investors, the reaction that the capital markets and the whole investment community had already after Paris. The day after Paris, when we all came up again after 20 hours of sleep, when the contract was signed, the Wall Street Journal came out with the fact that the financial industry already anticipated this change and immediately reacted with their shares in industry. And that was a huge game changer. So the first phase after Paris, which we've seen also from a European perspective, but I see also globally, was not driven by regulators, in my reading, but mainly by investors in financial industries through their shares of industry. The second development is now, and that's so interesting, that regulators coming, and that's logically following the beauty of Paris, when we see that we asked, of course, for the NDCs in +5, so regulators are under pressure, and basically the Green Deal is nothing else than a reaction to this delivering on the Paris Accord with strong regulations and strong standards. And what we see now, particularly in Europe, is what I always referred to earlier in my advisory work for both corporates but also policymakers. Strong standards make strong companies. I'm truly convinced that if we get the standards right, if we get the regulation right, we will see even stronger companies coming out of Europe in this field. What happens is that we have a very simultaneous discussion among policymakers in at least 3 major regions of the world. I would say in the North American area, in Europe, and in Asia here, about the question how we can support industry on their way through this, what I would call the great transformations. This simultaneous development is due to the fact that they all more and more understand that they have to deliver and that challenge their national industries to deliver on this. And what happens now is that we see sector by sector reactions in industry, depending on in which bucket of industry I would say they are. We have, of course, strong industry buckets that I would consider or name the transform or die bucket, right? If you look at cement, Jeremy earlier referred to Korean steel industry, chemicals, they cannot longer exist in the old way. They need green hydrogen, as Jeremy pointed out. Well, they need new energies to deliver and perform. Then we have a second bucket, which I would call transform to win. It's the high interest business models, logistic, life science services, consumer products that have a huge profit growth perspective. And there's, of course, the third bucket. Industry has to react, and this is a bucket I would call transform to transform. High impact business models like machinery, engineering, professional services firms even, that succeed by making sustainable transformation possible. And we can see top line growth all over in these sectors if they're making the right choices. I would say all of them have to make the right choices now. And this is something that we see all over in the boardrooms, the discussion now, how to make the right choices in order to avoid that the further investment based on fossil fuels are not stranded assets, or if I would call them sometimes even stranded costs. So my first point is what happens internationally, globally in the industry transformation goes back to Paris, and it's for sure a mixture of financial industry and regulators driving this change. Of course, the other players, consumers, employees, activists playing their role, but I think these two, regulators and investors, are the main drivers, and that goes back to the beauty of the Paris contract. My second point is that Germany, I do think, is setting the agenda for the EU's Green Deal at the moment and is driving the change globally. Germany has a very, very clear, transparent, and really constitutional right-based plan that gives us the ambition of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 up to 65%. That's a huge ambition, becoming climate neutral in the second or third wave then by 2045. And the government now came out with a plan developed by a broad coalition of think tanks that they want to reach this ambitious goal in 3 steps. The first steps, reaching the 2030 targets by 65% greenhouse gas emissions, would be basically to look into 4 fields: energy sector, transportation, industry, of course, being the third largest, very close to transportation, and buildings. This is where they want to focus on to reduce enormous amounts of CO2 tons. The second step, beyond 2030, is getting even more complicated when we will focus only on carbon-free technologies that are installed in industry, electricity, heating, and transportation. This will be basically a 95% reduction without negative emissions. That's unheard of, and I have to say, boardrooms are slowly only starting by understanding what this challenge means for them. That will be the much more complicated stuff than the one that we had until 2030. The 40% we reduced now, the next 25% are really hard, but then up to 95%, that will be very, very difficult. And the third step, this is the last 5% of non-avoidable greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and cement are, of course, offsetting via, I would say, biomass CCS. We will see a big CCS discussion, not only in Germany, but in Europe. And this will be, of course, a game changer, as you know, that there was a very critical discussion in Germany and Europe on CCS. I expect that we will deliver out this plan, and this is certainly a top priority by the new government, but of course challenged very much though by the effects of February 24. I argued in a paper that I published in Davos that the events of February 24 will even accelerate the green transformation. And there are good reasons to do this. But there are, of course, voices that say it makes it even more difficult. So let me come to my third point on the strategies how to get this done. And I think there are, with a very broad overview, looking into how we deal with this in Europe and Germany, I would say mainly 5 strategies. The first strategy, of course, and that's really important to understand, and don't underestimate the effort that the German government and the European administration is doing in this, is the massive expansion of renewable energies. The new goal of the traffic light governments are really ambitious in this. This is, and you know what that means for a country like Germany. We are not Norway, nor are we Namibia. We have a really, really very small country in comparison to the many cities and people that we have in the countryside also. So this is a big challenge for our country. The installed capacity of electricity generation of renewable energies will increase by far. We are thinking about an increasing, that means a triple of the speed in outrolling our renewable energy, and that's something that causes a lot of political and social controversies and discussions. First strategy, massive expansion of renewable energy in a new, as you know, all electricity world. The second strategy, of course, is energy efficiency. Primarily, energy consumption will be halved in Germany by 2045, especially in the heating sector. The primary energy consumption makes a huge difference, and there is, of course, major changes, particularly in this field since February 24, because there is a broader understanding and support in our population for this energy efficiency issue. I mean, to make an anecdotal wisdom, I have 3 daughters in my house, 13, 15, and 17 years old. So you can imagine the time that they are standing on the shower is a lot of time. And now after the war coming up, it's really en vogue to reduce the time to have hot showers because it's good for the freedom and the independence of Ukraine and to do something against the tyranny of Putin. And that really gives you a view of where the German political discussion among young people and many citizens is at the moment. The third strategy is electrification. Electrification of everything that is possible to electrify. Transportation, of course, heating, industry. Wherever we can, we will replace oil and gas as far as possible with electricity by 2045. And there we see a ramp up of heat pumps and e-mobility as key factors. We can see in some of the EU countries there are more e-mobility than in others. That's depending, of course, on the maturity of the infrastructure. That makes a huge difference. But now with new programs, not only in Germany, but also in France and the EU, we will see more of this and more infrastructure, which makes e-mobility even more successful. This makes a huge difference. Electrification of transportation, heating, industry to replace oil and gas, our third strategy. The fourth strategy, and that's really a global one, is hydrogen. And Jeremy referred earlier to the steel example. I would say not only steel, but in Germany for the whole chemical industry, this will be the huge new game. I speak of green hydrogen as the premier cru champagne of the new world, of the new energy world. I think we will use green hydrogen in particular for industry, not for mobility so well. And we will have, of course, a gas bridge. But since this gas bridge has broken away, you know that the German business model was very much relying on cheap fossil fuel imports from the East, cheap security from the US, and cheap access, if I may say so, to a global Chinese market. All 3 basics are broken away, I would say, or at least challenged by February 24. So there's a new thinking, and we will see, particularly in the steel industry, gas for direct reduction only available to a limited extent, and green hydrogen needed much sooner. So what we observe now, and I think that's the same all over, is a global hydrogen strategy. Germany, as other European countries, are looking into the global south to assure access to those places where we can import green hydrogen much faster and import them to save our industry. The fifth strategy, of course, is CCS, and I did refer to this earlier. I do expect from 2030 onwards the ramp up of CCS infrastructure. This will be needed not only in the steel chemistry, but many other process-related industry, but also as an energetic use of residual materials. We will see in our scenarios in two of the think tanks we are working with a huge importance for this in order to reach the 2045 goals. So let me sum up and maybe open it up then for your panel discussion. I completely agree with Jeremy's historic economic view on the development 1, 2, 3 industrial revolutions. I do agree that this is a major challenge for global industry. I do think, though, that we are in the lucky situation that we have actually the technologies in place, and we have, with regard to the constituencies I know best, which is Germany and Europe, a willingness to go there. It's about now execution. It's about speed and scale. It's about execution of the right strategies. I have addressed some of them, and I'm happy to learn how your discussion goes on with this. Thank you very much.